us to see things that, you know, the frailty of the human condition we can't quite see at today. And I think we should just be open-minded and prepared to deal with that as a community, because I think it's going to be complicated. So there's no bubble in that context.
Joe?
Yeah, Chamath just raised a very interesting point, which is there's no bubble if you take these models operate on the current path of trajectory, and but there's some breakthrough change, then the underlying, the energy infrastructure, all that stuff is gonna, that becomes a bubble in itself. It's sort of a bubble that's happens because conditions have changed. I think that's, I wouldn't call it a corner case, but that's something that you know, people should think about.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at right now, the massive amount of CapEx investment that all the hyperscalers, all the model companies are making, I mean, the latest quarter of reports that people are doubling their CapEx. It used to be last year, these hyperscalers are making $60 to $80 billion per company per year of CapEx, and now it's double, like 120 to 150 billion per year. It's astounding, just within a year, right? But here's the thing, I think a few things are driving it. Number one, people still believe in the scaling law, you know, and now also the idea that inference time scaling is important because more compute resources will be allocated to inference, and inference is where, you know, everybody that uses AI will touch influence as opposed to the few model companies that only do training, right? So a lot of CapEx that's going toward inference. And then finally, you have people making multimodal models that deal in generative rich media, videos, images, that will burn a lot of GPU resources. So people seeing this scaling law and multimodal world, and we haven't even talked about world models yet, and that's the validation that there will need to be more compute that need to be invested in. I don't think these trends are going to reverse or veer off. In the future, people will still continue to, you know, for example, are people going to consume less videos? I don't think so. So in that sense, there's no bubble. But having said that, people are investing, anticipating future demand as opposed to, I think there could be, you know, in certain sectors you see, you know, like memory, you see shortages today. But just the massive amounts of investment, it's kind of hard to think about ROI. I hate to be the CFO of one of these companies because they have to, they're faced of, you know, having to explain ROI to investors. They can't. You can't do that.
Yeah.
The theme for 2026, for those of you who've gone to Davos and for some of the other conferences and some of the other discussions, is AI agents. And, you know, agents are the name of the game. People have to actually try to work with agents, deploy, develop, and utilize the different agents that are going to do different tasks. We have a number of heads of state and heads of government in the room. The question that you're going to get when you say that is, we haven't started with deploying AI already, and you guys are now moving into agents. So if someone wants to leapfrog, someone who hasn't done anything yet, whether it's a nation in Africa or a nation in Latin America or a nation in you know, Southeast Asia, what would your advice be? Should they go into the generative AI model side of things? Should they try to do a specific thing with agents? What would be your advice if you were advising them?
Neither. I think it's, you have to pick a model, and I think you need to deploy it inside your own borders with your own power and roughly your own people, and be able to use it for a handful of very useful and practical solutions to everyday problems, whether it's public health or whether it's governmental services, or frankly, the most important and valuable one is education, which is being able to create a system that teaches the young people in your country how to learn in this new world where this supercomputer will be available to everybody. all this other stuff I think is very speculative. It's exactly what Joe said. Every frontier has a new language that it uses to justify further investment. And I think today, because there isn't a super clear ROI, agents are the next vernacular that we've chosen to justify the next $200 or $300 billion of investment. The more practical solution, I think, is to be one generation and one step behind that and say, let's go and educate our kids, cure some disease, and make it easier to renew our driver's license. And if you just do that, I think you're going to have a happy population.
So quality of life improvement.
I think so.
Joe?
I totally agree. I think governments have to think about what is the application where the use of AI will be productive and useful in education, in healthcare, and you should start with the use cases first. What is the right application for AI? I think the idea of building up the full stack infrastructure, everything, is a game for large economies. It's like building up a military industry. It's not for everybody. So once you've identified the use case and the applications, then the question is, all right, whose technology are we going to leverage on? And on that front, I believe that open source is the best way, is the most secure way where you can have most control of your own AI.
Gentlemen, that was a great discussion. I know that we could have gone on for so much longer, but thank you for your insights and thank you for being here today. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel discussion is titled, Is the Next Decade African? This session is moderated by Tucker Carlson, founder of the Tucker Carlson Network.
It's awfully nice of you to do this. I'd just like to go right down the line. And first to you, President Mnangagwa, again, thanks. In as clear terms as you can, I wonder if you would contrast your experience with China versus the Western powers. Do you think that Zimbabwe and other African countries, to be totally blunt, get a better deal from Chinese investment than they have with Western powers over the past 150 years?
Well, my view is that initially, as we became independent, we had most of our development thrust was from the West. But as we evolved, we have also benefited from investment and cooperation from countries like China.
But what are, I mean, the basic structure seems the same. Foreign powers extract mineral wealth from various African countries, but do you think that the arrangement that Zimbabwe and other countries currently have with China is better or worse for Zimbabwe than it was under, say, the Brits?
I think the premises upon which you construct your question, I don't think is perfect.
Not surprised.
Yes, Zimbabwe is a sovereign state.
Yes.
You understand? And we move on the basis that gives us the best results of our resources. Whether it is relation with the West or the East, what is primarily important is what we ourselves as Zimbabweans are satisfied with. We don't need to please the West or please the East. We please ourselves.
Good. That seems like a good model for every sovereign country. President Bio, thank you for this. Do you think that there is a substantial difference? I'm just trying to understand from a Western perspective how the East does business in Africa versus how the West does. And it may be too sensitive a topic really even to talk about out loud, but to the extent you have a view you can share, would you?
I'm sure relations cannot be measured country by country.
Yes.
Relations depend on the historical background of countries between one country and another.
Yes.
That's the basis on which relations grow and are nurtured. For us in Zimbabwe, yes, we are a former British colony, but we are very happy with the relations that have now developed with, say, countries like China and so on.
Yes.
Despite being a former British colony.
I think this maybe one of these topics is too difficult to talk about in public, so let me just ask you, President Bio, about one of the strengths of your country and the continent, which is its birth rate, which so far surpasses that of any other region in the world, and that seems like a strength. How has your country, Sierra Leone, but also many other countries in Africa, been able to maintain a birth rate at replacement when Europe, the US, Canada, lots of other parts of the world have not been able to?
Thank you very much. I think we are hard workers, and we work both in the day and at night. And
that is such great advice.
It is essential to have young people and to keep the birth rate at the right level so that there is sustainability in development. What we do today, or as leaders, we provide the enabling environment, provide them with the tools, the young people to navigate the world, which is extremely tough, complicated, and evolving and changing all the time. So it is our responsibility to bear that in mind. We have to plan ahead, be ahead of the curve to be able to replace accordingly so that we don't have a gap in our development process. So we have been busy producing as much as we can, a lot of good people, and we are investing in their education so that they are fit for purpose for a world that is becoming digital and, of course, going extremely to the edge of technological advancement.
If I could just ask a quick follow-up to you, Mr. President. Do you keep track precisely of how many of your young, educated citizens leave and how many stay? Are you thinking hard about how to retain the smartest, most energetic people?
Definitely. In fact, what my administration did was to make sure that we provide basic primary and secondary education free of charge to the citizens. Every child born in Sierra Leone can go to school and finish high school without paying a penny. We don't just provide tuition. We also make sure that we provide other essentials to make it possible so that nobody has excuse not to go to school, because in the 21st century, without education, definitely you can make it. And we do not just want to make it at the personal level, family level. We want to grow as a nation. We want to be useful citizens of West Africa, the community that I chair today. But we also want to be useful citizens, global useful citizens that can contribute to the world. So we are taking stock of that, and we are educating them, equipping them. In fact, I call education as an equipment, a navigation equipment in a world that is becoming very, very complicated and complex.
Thank you. President Boko, as you look at young people in Botswana who are educated and energetic, what's your pitch to them? What's your argument to them to stay in Botswana, not go to South Africa, Europe, the United States?
Young people are generally innovative. They are entrepreneurial. They now have become digital natives, and that presents immense opportunities to them. These opportunities mean they can pretty much operate wherever they are, and they must, as a matter of course, remain within Botswana so that they can then spread their reach and influence to every part from Botswana. And so the opportunities that there are in Botswana, the training, the education, the acquisition of skills, the support, the environment that nurtures them and feeds and fuels their verve and vitality is what Botswana offers and what will power Africa. Africa generally is a very young continent with a median age of 19.3. Botswana's median age is 25. And so with such a population, Africa is poised to rule the world.
So what are your plans for the world once you rule it?
To make it fairer, to make it more equitable, to ensure that intellectual property is internalized in every part of the African continent, that innovation serves humanity, not just a predatory elite, and that everybody can partake equitably and benefit from the fruits of the economy and the vast opportunities that are available in the world.
Well, I look forward to being treated fairly under your rule. Thank you. President Mnangagwa, I wonder what lessons you've been in the government of Zimbabwe for decades in various roles, including through a very turbulent period where your predecessor famously kicked out the whites and then the economy tanked and now it's rising again. I wonder if you would summarize the lessons that your country has learned from that experience.
I'm not so sure what you have in mind. But let me say, our economy has faced challenges. I'm sure you're aware.
Yes.
Zimbabwe has been under sanctions for decades as a result of us claiming our land from the British and making ourselves independent. We seized the land and gave it to our people. So sanctions were imposed on us. But in spite of all that constraint we have developed, and we are happy that we have developed on our own, and we feel very independent.
Well, some of the land was seized from people who were born there. So I wonder if there's a lesson about targeting people on the basis of their skin color. Do you think?
Can I hear you?
Well, people had their land seized in Zimbabwe who were born in Zimbabwe, and they were targeted on the basis of their race, and I wonder if you think that's good or bad.
No. Land did not belong to a race. It belonged to Zimbabweans. Right. So when the colonialists took land from us, time came when we asserted ourselves, take back our land. And those who wanted to have land at the same basis as the African people of Zimbabwe remained. But those who felt they were superior left.
Okay. Mr. Bio, it does seem like, Mr. President, that the model of government around the world seems to be changing, and people seem to have lost confidence in democracy, at least in the West. People aren't quite as keen to promote democracy. Do you notice this? Do you think democracy is in retreat around the world?
I think the world is in transition.
Yes.
And normally that comes along with instability. I normally refer to it as we are in a state of flux.
Yes.
We have been told to go democratic, and those who are leading the way or who have been teaching us to be democratic are no longer committed to that method of governance. So we are left to choose, but I still believe that democracy is the best method of governance, choosing who leads, especially liberal democracy with all the freedoms that go with it, so that human rights and other liberties are observed and maintained. We remain committed to democracy, irrespective of the fact that there are now reversers, even in Africa, around the world. In fact, these days, when you listen to world news and other things, you hardly hear about democracy. You're very right. But we are committed to it because it is the best form until we can provide an alternative that can really sit well with us in society. We remain
really
yes.
into the historical space and climb. China only lifted itself out of abject poverty over the last 40 years. We've been free from colonialism now in Botswana for almost 60 years. We have had an affinity with the West because of the relationship, the special relationship that we've had with them. And China has only come in, and we relate with China on terms that we define ourselves. We look at what it is that China offers, what it is that we need, and we sit and good a deal as we are able to negotiate in a situation where all the parties come to the table and present their offerings. So I think the relations are shaped largely by what the interests of these African countries, ourselves included, are.
Interesting. President Mnangagwa, what did you think of what happened in Venezuela last month?
Venezuela is very far away from Zimbabwe.
Yes, it is. yes, sir. But I wonder, I still wonder as a head of state, a longtime head of state, what you thought of that. I mean, you must pay attention to what happens to other heads of state.
Yeah, but I don't know what we really read in Zimbabwe actually happens in Venezuela, but from what we read, we are interested to know why it is happening.
But President B, what did you think?
I was stunned, and I'm still stunned. It was so surreal that I still have to understand whether the world order, the rules-based society, is still existing, and if not, what becomes of the world? That's why I earlier described the state as we are in a state of flux, because everything that we have understood as the basis for international order is fragmenting or being destroyed right in our face.
And I'm sorry, it felt like an unfair question, but that's exactly more to the point what I'm asking is this a sign of a changing order? And I will end with you, President Boko. What was your response to it?
Well, I think we are seeing a world where rules seem to matter very little, and they matter only depending on who is benefiting from them and who is wielding the stick at any given point in time. We know that public international law respects territorial integrity, it respects the sovereignty of nations. And it also requires that the people of every nation state must exercise their self-determination. They must determine what happens within their borders. And to have external powers intrude and remove any head of state, regardless of what the circumstances are, I think it's something that is utterly shocking, and it is an affront to a rule-based international order. I think it must be described in starkly those terms and nothing pretentious.
Gentlemen, thank you for doing this and for your patience with my questions, and I really appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Questions to understand how we collectively can create impact going beyond what works in social welfare. As you all know, governments have been very good at helping people do the right thing. Behavioral science helped simplify decisions, remove friction, and guide behavior. But life is now changing faster than systems can keep up, and uncertainty is constant. And social welfare exists for these moments. Systems provide support, but they also do something more powerful. They shape how people see themselves. So today we're going to talk about welfare systems. And yes, welfare is a safety net, but it's also a teacher. It teaches people whether they're capable, whether they're trusted, whether they're expected to steer their own lives. So this session is called Empowerment by Design because we're exploring a shift from welfare that shapes behavior to welfare that builds human capacity. And that's the conversation we're going to have today with our esteemed guest. So before we begin, I'll just tell you how the conversation will go. I'm going to ask one central question to each guest, and then it's not only to extract answers, but to surface a lot of judgments that will help us all in our decision making. So to David Halpern, you were central to bringing behavioral science into governments, and you helped states shape decisions at scale. So I want to ask you with not what works, but what lasts. So here's the question. What does behavioral science genuinely, when does it empower people, and when does it quietly cross an invisible line, training people to function only when the system exists?
Right, it's a great question. Thank you. It's lovely to be here, Your Excellencies and other esteemed guests. So the classic thing that people tend to think of with behavioral science is what's called changing the choice architecture. So we go to the canteen, and it's a good idea to put the salad before the chips. It was a good example, because we're in a hurry and we're hungry. And one argument is when you remove that, well, will I just go back to eating all the chips? Well, an important point is the canteen is still there today and tomorrow and so on. And it can also start to change your taste too. But will it stick? Will it persist in other ways? And so there's more and more interest in interventions, which we were just saying before, not just nudges, but are called boosts in some ways. And a good welfare one we were talking about at a session earlier today is many welfare systems have built around what's called active welfare. Are you really looking for work? So across the world, by the way, they are better than not asking people, you know. So you turn up and you have to show that you look for several jobs. Now, I've sat in on those interviews. One of the things we did as good behavioral scientists, you're like ethnographers and you spend time out there. And you'd see, for example, I come to my mind, a young man coming into one of these sessions. He knows exactly the routine, what he's supposed to do, fill in the form, tick this thing. He's almost on autopilot. He's been trained by the system to do that. And so we changed it from a system, instead of asking people, what did you do last week, to say, what are you going to do next week? Which sounds like a small change, but it turns out to be really fundamental, because you are now activating someone to be, think ahead and so on. Another key change, though, goes to your point, is instead of the administrator doing the paperwork, we said the person should do it themselves. They should write down themselves what they're going to do next week, not for them. And first of all, you can see when this change came in, people are almost like, wait a minute, what? You do the paperwork, don't you? No, because you're trying to mobilize and activate someone. So these are really important kind of shifts as we try and make, sometimes you create scaffolding, but you make change. And in the end, we're trying to make people not just make better decisions, but be better decision makers in their own right, which I think goes to your point.
So you mentioned something about activate. Can you give us an example of what distinguishes the intervention that changes behavior for a moment, so you change the person that you said, you asked him what you're going to do next week,
yes,
to changing his identity for a lifetime. And so can you give us a bit of a sneak peek? There's something more cooler than nudging called boosting that David Halpern is working on. So I want to understand, what does boosting do? Does it change someone's identity forever? Does it leave an imprint, a soul print?
Very good. So yes, this is, I mentioned, and thank you for pushing on it. If I'm working on a book here, I'm spending some time here and also on Boost. So I'll give you an example, and we were just talking about it, from, again, young people. This is some work in the US, but we see it in many other places. So young people who, in Chicago classically, brought in quite difficult circumstances, and they have learned in their lives, if someone pushes you, you better push back. If someone comes along and is you're a young kid and says, can I have your pocket money? If you don't push back, they'll come back tomorrow and ask for your mobile phone, right? So you learn it, and then you learn to react hard. This leads to violence often because it becomes inappropriate as the kids become men. So there was this program called Becoming a Man, developed by Chicago, and it was inspired by a murder, I'm afraid to say, of a young, lovely PhD student from Senegal, actually, who was shot by a 17-year-old. He came out of the library, he had books on, it was late at night, he gets stopped by this kid. He must have just paused, resisted for a second, he gets shot and he dies. Now that 17-year-old was eventually given 120 years in prison. Was that going to make a difference if it had been 200 years or 300 years to his behavior in that moment? So the idea of this Becoming a Man program was that we need to reach into the minds of these young people. And so this exercise, and I'll just explain if it's not too long, they give these young people, put them into pairs, and they'd say, here's a ball, I'll give the ball to you, I'm supposed to take it from you. You can imagine these kids start scrapping, and they pull and they're punching and whatever. And then eventually, calm down, okay, let's talk about what happened there. And they'll say, why didn't you just ask him for the ball? None of them ask. Well, why would I do that? He'll think I'm a punk, was the word. So they said, well, let's ask him. If we'd said, would you give him the ball? You'd say, yeah, it's a stupid ball. What do I care about the ball? But it illustrates a very profound point, which these young people have got a mindset, which is, I push back. And the kids themselves call this program, it's based about cognitive behavioral therapy, but Control-Alt-Shift. Like you do on a computer, when it's not working properly, you press it. So when you become emotional and angry, wait a minute, I just stopped myself. Is there an alternative? So if that's not a nudge now, that's what we would call a boost, a very powerful program, halves violence, halves subsequent arrest in these young people. This is very powerful for lots of things. We could all use a boost in a similar way, sometimes.
I'd like to reflect on that. This relates a lot to social welfare, because welfare or social welfare changes a lot of outcomes for people's lives, but the question we all need to ask is, does it even shape people? Will they grow? What will happen to their mind? Do they still depend on us? And I think that's where empowerment comes into place. I have one more question. If we want to be successful or truly serious about empowerment in different realms of policy, what should governments stop doing even when it looks successful on paper, but actually it doesn't change anything, because if you remove that system, that person will not change his behavior forever. So it's kind of going beyond the nudge, but it might look amazing on paper. Can you give us an example on that?
Well, I think we often see it in welfare systems where people become dependent. Other examples we see in other countries is that the example I mentioned earlier is because the systems are often designed on the basis we think you might be cheating, and so they inadvertently signal, because one of the things about human beings is we don't quite know what other people think, and so we have to infer. And if a system is treating us like I might be cheating, then I think, well, maybe everybody else is cheating, right? It becomes actually potentially toxic. So there are times where if we build this scaffolding to make the change, to get someone back to the labor market or whatever it will be, we should also think about, can we dismantle it and will it persist? And so that's true in many areas where, be it on diet or whatever, why we often move to reformulation, because we want to move the upstream things. We can remove the scaffolding and the behavior will change. Or in the example I gave earlier, that the young person is literally thinking differently. Their system 2, as we would say, kicks in at the right moment. So we can step back. They'll look after it themselves.
Thank you, David. Minister Masagos, you govern across culture, policy, real human capacity. And what distinguishes, I think, your work is it doesn't just begin with policy, it begins with people. So I want to place you inside the moral tension of social welfare. Mm-hmm. How does Singapore balance providing social support while preserving the agency of these beneficiaries and enabling empowerment without the scaffolding?
Yes. Well, thank you for the opportunity to address the esteemed audience here, and also to have an interaction with people who know where the evidence is. So all of us know how to do it, but governments need to decide who should be doing it, where it should apply, and when. And what we have decided when I took over about 7 years ago, the Ministry for Social and Family Development, is to shift focus on the individual to the family. That was the first paradigm shift we did. Because when we want something to last, or even something to begin, it begins with the family. Values get transmitted through the family. And also, while rights are important, very critical, to ensure rights of children, women, everything must be provided for, we must also recognize, at least in our societies, that duties are as important. So duties is always something we balance with rights, and that happens best in a family. So the family need to be functioning, and therefore, in defining a functioning family in Singapore, we put it quite simply in 3 S's, which we measure with our researchers and so forth. Are they stable? Are they self-reliant? Do they attain self-mobility? Now, this applies to all families. And some families, though, do fall through the crack temporarily, and how then do we bounce them up to attain these 3 S's and not lose these 3 S's? But some family can be entrenched because of their circumstances and so forth. And therefore, where do we start this work? We have now shifted from from waiting for the families to come to us when they have trouble, to knocking doors, identifying who would be vulnerable, and being proactive and upstream. And this is something is very difficult to do because it's more costly and takes a lot of time. And it's harder for research to show that you have prevented something from happening because it didn't happen. And therefore, we have to sort of reshape how we approach this and going upstream. As an example, we now have looking at the data of those who we think in all probability, using AI, using data, large models and so forth, say these are the group of families we should knock doors, and then we want to provide support for them. And here is who should be doing it. And it is not something we have decided, and we think that no government can do it alone. And to bring all the community assets together, including volunteers who become befrienders to these families, corporates who have money, who at one time will just give the money to philanthropies and then walk away and say, I've given millions of dollars, but to measure the impact and to make it a sustainable contribution. Not one time, not 2 times, but how many years for the impact to be felt, then it's reported back to them. And also professionals who need to be uplifted. So a whole of society approach, and then using the sciences that our esteemed researchers tell us over time how it has changed and what we can do, and put that together. I think that's the framework with which our government address this problem. And like you mentioned, it's moving from social welfare to empowerment, self-reliant.
On that, Minister, I want to ask you, how do welfare systems strengthen dignity and ownership? And if you can give us an example, when you said the focus is on family, did you use behavioral science to nudge them maybe, or you're thinking of a policy that will boost them towards not relying only on the system and not creating this dependency? Because it's also a mindset among beneficiaries.
Indeed, indeed. In fact, this is the gist of the design that we have in a program we call Comlink Plus. First, identifying who will be vulnerable, and then inviting them to join the program, not telling them you have to join the program, inviting them. Actually, half of the families we outreach to joined us. The other half say, either leave us alone, or we don't believe this program, or whatever reason, but you want to respect them for that. And the families that come with us, we provide them three important resources. Number one, the befrienders, people who need to be there for no other reason than I care, not because I want to, I have something more than you and I want to share with you, or whatever it is. I just want to be your friend. And therefore, people they can go back to when they have problems they need to share about, personal problems. And then we have what we call almost a para-counselors, para-social workers. These are trained about programs, not the social work type of program, but what programs are available to nudge them to do, for now, three things. Number one, to ensure they keep their children in school. Enroll the children early, because preschool is a very important part of development. If they may have given up on their lives, we want them to see the future in their children. And that
how did you nudge them to ensure that they enroll their kids? Like, what policy was it? Was it a nudge or a decree or a law?
Yes. The simple policy is to give them money if they put their children.
So an incentive with money. But
incentive.
If you remove the money, what's going to happen? Did they believe in it? Do they believe in the power of early education?
Which is why the befriender is important, to persuade them and to show them what works. I come from a family which benefited from social mobility. And when I meet them and say, look, I used to be like you too. I live in a home which I rented. I moved 11 times before I was 3 years old. But in Singapore, you don't have to be like this all your life, all for your children. Just keep your children in school. Start them early. So that kind of advice, that kind of personal connection is important. But many people who do this don't know where the programs are. And therefore, you need to have trained coaches who know what different kind of archetypes of family need. At the same time, then, those who we know could be in trouble or need more therapies and so forth, that's when the social worker comes in. So again, it's a whole of society program. Just one point is that much of the incentives are contributed not by the government. It's given by corporates who say, I want to do the preschool program. I will give $10 million every year, but you make sure you spend it, and I want to see the impact. So they see the connection between being good, not just a company that makes money, but with a social mission. Actually, we have also found out that the employees choose this kind of company, especially the young. And putting this all together is something we have started moving for the last 3 years. But again, research is going to be very important to validate whether what we are doing is good, what we're doing is impactful. And I say, we don't want to conclude that this will have a good outcome, but certainly we are happy with the involvement of so many parts of society together, including the dignity that we give to the families who want to do this.
I think when we talk about welfare and empowerment, it's not a simple equation to say when we use this nudge and we remove it, what's going to happen to the people. We need to really study it over the long term. Who people become, did they grow, did it change? And what I'm hearing from you all is empowerment and social welfare is more than design. It is about understanding the proper discipline of policymakers to really stick with the decision and self-correct along the way, especially with dependence and social welfare. So it requires a lot of courage. I want to end as a joint question for both of you. How do we know when the support is still helping, or when it's quietly replaced people's judgment that they don't even think for themselves anymore? In your case, giving the money for young parents to put their kids in school, they automatically will just enroll them because you gave them the incentive or the money. Remove the money, I don't think so. They really believed in it could be applied to health, to parenting, to a professional life. How do you know that they really believe in it? So maybe the idea of boosting, and I just want to clarify what I mean here. When welfare builds capacity and it changes people's mindset, it builds dignity. Yes. When you are building dependency and you took away their agency, you're kind of creating this kind of reliance and it erodes dignity. And so the question, and maybe the highest ambition or goal of social policy, is not better compliance to my nudge, it's stronger people. And goes back to, David, what you said, it's did we grow people, did we change them, did you change the mindset of that guy? So what's your 2 cents on that, on building capacity, and what empowerment by design truly means?
So it's very interesting that you talked about parenting too, because I think there's a classic kind of a distinction often made in parenting, which is very relevant to government, which is when you're teaching your kids. It's normally a contrast between, are you liberal? You do whatever you want. Like, that turns out, by the way, not to be great, often. Or do you be authoritarian, which is, I tell you exactly, you could do this, very, lots and lots of rules. That's not great either. And the magic formula is what's called authoritative. So you intervene occasionally, but you explain to your child why. When they're going to put their kids in the electrical socket, you don't just say, no, we never do that. So you shouldn't do it because you explain why. And what's the difference? Is because authoritative means they now understand the world and it sticks, it persists when you're not there as well, right? And that to some extent applies to governments too. We need to be in the authoritative space. You talked about, I think, dignity. I tried to give you an example earlier. A key part about that is you're no longer being a policeman, but you're respecting the person's dignity and they're building their own agency. But the last thing which we touched on, I think, is incredibly important and often underestimated in Western governments is the social network and the community. It's the family, absolutely. Who is your first line of call for welfare when you need it? It is your family. It may be your neighbors, your friends. Only late on is it often government. And it often reminds me of some work we've been doing at the moment with communities and community building, is that it's been underestimated the importance of building the community infrastructure. Singapore, famous the example of it. And it reminds me of almost a biblical example, you know, of the feeding of the 5,000. How does that work? We sort of see it in everyday life, where you enable people to mutually support each other is an incredibly powerful tool, which you don't see if you only see it welfare through a very narrow individual lens.
Yes.
What's your take on the authoritative space of government?
Well, the most important thing for me, at least, is to have the courage to share and to open this data to researchers, to people who will then present this and criticize you in public to say, no, this doesn't work. Or the evidence says that you have to shift it somewhere else. For the longest time, governments have internal mechanisms to do that, and you can hide your embarrassment because you don't share the data. Today in Singapore, more and more of us are in various parts of government want third parties to come appraise us, give us a critique, even publish the paper, and be open about it. Because we know that the virtue of all what governments want to do, this is always the part that we are very happy about. But the courage to accept that there are failures and that we need to shift can only come from people who produce this from evidence, from research that is objective, no motivation, not a political opposition, whatever it is. And therefore, you can take it even with a pinch of salt. And then you move on. They say, yes, this is something we have misgivings about, we should move on. And this is how Singapore has improved over the years, starting from internal criticism and not sharing it, and now, hopefully with more courage to share this data with the external evaluators to tell us how to do it better.
I think as I reflect on both, the quiet truth of maybe behavioral science is that every system we build is building a human being. Not loudly, not dramatically, but relentlessly on what it assumes as a policy, what it rewards, and I think also maybe what it requires. And if we take social welfare, it's also a teacher. It builds capacity. It's telling these people and these beneficiaries whether they're capable, whether the government believes in them, whether they're trusted, but also not to comply, and whether they're expected to try on their own. Yes. And I think for us, as you said, data, the authoritative space of government, we need to kind of explain why, but also create that ecosystem around it. So it's not just one cut solution.
Indeed.
I know this is the end of our session. There's 30 seconds. I just want to say thank you for your time and insights today. And we can't wait to understand what boosting can do to policy, and also understand and learn from Singapore. If there's something beautiful about Singapore, we love the intellectual humility you all exude from all governments around the world. And maybe Dave Halpern said it so perfectly that any innovation that happens around the world, you always see a Singaporean learning from that innovation. And I think it's something that also the UAE exudes, the love for learning and the love for self-correction. And I hope all of us as governments continue to improve our social policies. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.